So I was really excited to talk about this article that you wrote for Jacobin, because it combines two of my favorite subjects, right? You know, about which are socialism and analytic philosophy, which are, in my experience, not things that you often see mentioned in the same breath.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's also the intersection of two of my biggest interests. I'm proud that Jacobin, unlike most left-wing publications, I think over the years has given more of a voice to, analytic philosophers and fellow travelers such as yourself. So, yeah, happy to have this out there.
Yeah. There has been some of that. I mean, I feel like there's that yeah, I mean, last year I wrote some articles about Jacobin, and I know Matt McManus will come on to talk about roles. But I think like this is interesting to me. And actually, I should say, like what's your own background with this stuff? I mean, like.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I did my PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. I think it's known as a pretty analytic department as opposed to continental. I specialized in moral and political philosophy. So yeah, spent a lot of time poring over Rawls's theory of justice and responses to it. As well as folks like Jerry Cohen, of course.
Yeah, so yes, I like it's not a big pipeline, but the philosophy grad school to Jacobin pipeline is
Yeah.
is one that I like. But in one of the interesting things I think about what you're doing in this article is that, yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, Jacobin is certainly vastly more likely than just about anywhere else to like actually have like actually print an article about, like, hey, here's why John Rawls, for example, says something that's sort of interesting from a socialist perspective. Then uh, but here, you're talking a little bit more broadly about analytic philosophy, sort of partially in response to another article that was much more critical of it. But just so I can get people's like just to kind of ground anybody who maybe only vaguely knows what we're talking about. Like when people say like analytic philosophy, I'm not going to ask you for a definition because it's sort of famously impossible to give one, right? But like maybe at least a sort of brief evocative sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think of it as kind of like a 20th century sociological distinction, like among American philosophy departments, especially. So a lot of American philosophy departments were classified as analytic because they tended to be strongly influenced by and responding to figures that came out of a certain tradition, some of which talked about in this article that I was responding to by Christoph Scheringa. So the Vienna Circle, people like Rudolf Carnap, as well as English philosophers like Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who moved from Vienna to England. And yeah, a lot of it was very much focused on sort of trying to translate traditional philosophical problems into logically rigorous language.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, that sort of narrow conception of philosophy in analytic departments became less popular, but there was still a kind of, I guess, vibe, like science-y, mathy vibe that we're going to try to be as sort of rigorous and precise as possible in clarifying concepts and in formulating and trying to answer traditional philosophical problems. And this is opposed to philosophers who identified with the so-called continental tradition, who tended to be less into this sort of project of scientizing or logicizing philosophy. A lot of them were responding more to the Hegelian tradition or to people like Nietzsche or Heidegger. Later on, the post-structuralists were very influential. So people like Derrida and Foucault. So they kind of became sort of like camps within American philosophy is my way of thinking about it. I do think that has broken down a lot now, but there are, there's still sort of the vibe-based distinction,
Yeah.
like analytic philosophers and continental philosophers.
You're sort of in this weird place where you have people we think of as analytic philosophers who, write books agreeing with Hegel, or who like do philosophy of mind, and they're like really into like drawing insights from Heidegger for that or whatever. We still sort of,
Right.
in terms of style presentation, kind of argumentative style, maybe some influences, right? There's still the sense that you sort of know what people mean, right? When they use these terms, analytic, and yeah. And but also in terms of where you were, like what you're doing in this article, kind of going back a little ways, right, to sort of people who are analytic philosophers who are writing at a time when there is maybe a clear distinction to be made, like Rawls, for example, right? Like you. Or Jacobin has come up a couple times. You kind of make the case that there's something that's like really valuable in the style of argumentation and in some of the sort of intellectual tools that are associated with it, that Marxists can kind of benefit from engaging with. So like in my the thing that I wrote, on the Substack about this sort of little mini debate about the value of analytic philosophy. I mean, I was sort of very focused for a lot of it on the, hey, look at all these important figures in analytic philosophy who are socialists aspect. But like what I liked about your article is that you were sort of pressing like a slightly different point than that, which is not so much like, okay, let's kind of forget for a second the sociology of analytic philosophy, like what the politics of any particular philosophers are, or how this played out historically, right? All that stuff. The original Scheringa, a lot of it was about that. A lot of what I wrote was about that, right? But like let's just think about what's sort of value in this kind of set of analytical tools. And one thing, point that I thought you made really well in there is that it's sort of there's this sort of weird tendency that some Marxists have to think that the kind of most Marxist thing to do is to just sort of not really make any arguments or sort of appeal to any appeal to any tools of analysis that Marx himself wasn't working with. That you're just kind of repeating what the big guy said, and you're making arguments in the ways that are sort of most similar to how he himself might do it, since Marx obviously came originally out of the young Hegelians and was very influenced by reading Hegel, so you sort of put things in Hegelese, which I've got to say always reminds me in a weird way of like somebody who's like maybe not a very good guitar player who's like, oh, but this is like the exact same kind of distortion pedal that Jimi Hendrix used. It's like, yeah, okay, but like, what are you going to do with that, right? And you make this point really nicely at the beginning of the article that Marx himself was sort of very open to kind of using what could whatever was available to him to make his arguments, right? Like in a lot of capital, like a surprising amount of capital, is just Marx kind of making use of the reports of these factory inspectors who are not like these aren't like revolutionary socialist commissars. These are like Victorian era British state bureaucrats.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's. Oh, did you freeze again?
Oh no, Oh no,
Oh, you're
did I
here.
freeze?
Okay, you just no, you're
All
good.
right,
You
so,
just stopped in a
all right,
very you were very still for a moment.
okay,
Um,
okay.
yeah, no, I think it is really interesting. I mean, Marx was both, trying to take advantage of like what he thought was the best, the most important intellectual resources of his time, which included Hegelian philosophy as well as British economics. And yeah, of course, a lot of those people, the vast majority of those people, were not socialists or critics of capitalism, but he was trying to use those tools to mount a critique of capitalism. And yeah, it's an interesting question why so many of his followers, when it comes to sort of conceptual resources, intellectual resources made available after the time of his writing, why so many of them kind of are averse to having a similar sort of spirit that Marx had. I mean, I do think part of it is because they're drawing on certain things that Marx said and certain things that his followers said. I mean, I do think that you know Marx had these sort of very famous sort of injunctions against moral philosophy or sort of constructing visions of what an ideal socialist society would look like. So I think that people have really you know jumped on that to resist doing any kind of moral theorizing, and they've used that to think that that's somehow anti-Marxist or anti-materialist, and I think that's a part of Marx that we need to critique. Actually, similarly with the Hegelian stuff, I think a lot of people who followed Marx thought, oh, there's something very key about the kind of there's some sort of special Hegelian method that Marx is using that is fundamentally opposed to the methods of non-Hegelian social science or non-Hegelian philosophy. And so I think that strand of thinking has led to a big suspicion of anything that smacks of traditional economics or like neoclassical economics at all. um, Anything that seems like things like game theory that involve analyzing individuals in terms of like rational choices and the way that trying to use that sort of understanding of what's rational for individuals in certain situations, using that as a framework for understanding society. People have thought, well, that's not Hegelian because the Hegelian view is that society is some kind of totality, and that's incompatible with a game theoretic approach or attention to individual motivations and interests.
Yeah, I mean, like, in fact, that article you responded to mentioned a couple times. Like, I think it actually has a line about game theory, decision theory, and something else. Being tools of Cold War research, which is like, okay, fair enough. I mean, so is a computer. I can still use it to
Yeah.
spread spread socialist ideas and analysis. But yeah, that last point you made is really interesting to me about. Because like when you think about where this tension between or alleged tension between sort of some kind of specifically Hegelian methodology and all the rest of the stuff is supposed to come from, I mean, sometimes it can be very funny, like watching people try to pin it down. Like I wish I remembered the name of his interlocutor in this discussion, but I remember Steve Paxton, who wrote a very good book called Unlearning Marx. He was on Doug Lane's old YouTube channel, and whoever it was that he was arguing with on there, was sort of making this case like, no, you need this like Hegelian methodology or whatever. So like G.A. Cohen, for example, because the immediate context was they're talking about Cohen's book, Karl Marx's Theory of History,
Mm.
a defense, and in that and this guy said, no, this isn't like real Marxism because you don't have this Hegelian methodology, and Steve's kind of pushing like, okay, well, tell me about the Hegelian methodology, right? I mean, what
Right.
is it that's what is it that's all about. And he kind of comes up with like, well, it's all about seeing things as being interconnected and changing. And it's like, well, I don't know, there's a lot of that in that book, right? It's a lot about the connections between things. There's a lot about stuff changing, right? And it sort of feels almost trollish because like, you feel like interpreting it that literally, you're almost missing something. But like, also seriously, like, what's that seems like it, right? And but I think the sort of most maybe kind of the more interesting version is what you said at the end there about roughly what you're talking about is what's sometimes called methodological individualism, the idea that you should try to understand what's going on in society as a whole, that like if you're going to have a kind of complete theory of that, you're not done yet until you've sort of understood how this plays out in terms of individual behavior. So like the obvious example from a Marxist perspective would be oftentimes you'll hear Marxists say things like, well, such and such happens, like some social phenomenon, right? This happens because it's in the interest of the capitalist class, or even like
Right.
Say it's in the interest of capitalism, to do it. And
the functional explanation.
Yeah, and so okay, well, but like, what's the just saying this helps the capitalist class or this helps capitalism isn't actually an explanation of why it happens, because presumably for the thing to happen, you need a lot of particular individual people to do stuff, and you need to explain like what motivates them to do the things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's sort of ironic about the people who I think push back on the use of things like game theory or methodological individualism. I mean, just a brief aside, I think methodological individualism is a term I avoided because I think that's sort of a messy debate, and like on some understandings of it, maybe it's wrong, but I do think there's a core insight there, and this is what Eric Wright thought, which is that basically what you just said, which is you need to cash out, any sort of explanations of social dynamics in terms of at least a lot of it needs to be cashed out in terms of individual preferences, motivations, behavior. So I think a good way of understanding what a lot of analytical Marxists are trying to do, and I think this is how they themselves understood it, is take some of the sort of functional explanations, X happens because it's in the interests of capitalists or capitalism, and just sort of cash that out in terms of, well, what are the sort of pressures on individual behavior, and what are the individual behaviors that are actually underlying these dynamics that Marx and Marxists talked about. And like, if we want to think of society as, this holistic unity and it's interconnected, well, what exactly are the connections? what are the parts of that unity doing to reproduce it?
Yeah, exactly. And so somebody in particular you mentioned in that connection in the article is a sociologist, but like somebody who's in this sort of intellectual current of analytical Marxism, is Eric Olin, right?
Yeah, and I mean, Wright, I think is a lot of his work is focused on basically understanding class in a rigorous way. I mean, Marx talks a lot about class. I think one of Marx's greatest contributions to Western thought is like thinking seriously about class and what it means, and what sort of social dynamics we can expect because of what classes are by nature and the way they interact. So I think Eric Olin Wright's work is really important because he was trying to really figure out different dimensions of class. In the article, I focus basically on his work on class location, and Wright tries to define in a rigorous way, like, what does it mean to be a member of a class? And he cashes that out in terms of, what's following Marx, what is the individual's relationship to the means of production, and how does that affect what they have to do in order to survive? How does that affect their interests? How does that pit their interests against the interests of people in other classes. And yeah, he takes a very, what I would say, an individualistic approach to understanding class in some ways, right? Classes aren't just these sort of amorphous collectivities. No, they're it's a group category that's based on what different individuals have in common in terms of their material interests and what they have to do to reproduce themselves. So I think that's like pretty fundamental. I think that's a good example of how these sort of tools of like traditional or not traditional, but like non-Marxist social science or individualistic social science can be useful in making sense of capitalism. Oh, Ben, I think you're muted.
So I am. So yeah, if you have those social scientific tools that are all about analysis of individual circumstances and individual interests and how that manifests in individual behavior, I mean, I can kind of understand how at first glance somebody can hear that and say, "Oh, so you're talking about individuals, so you're going to be missing the boat." Because what I'm interested in talking about is classes, but I mean, essentially, using rights work and also using sort of more, you know, a much more recent example. I think this book came out last year. You mentioned the Class Matrix by Vivek Jibber. Um, that these are Wright and Chipper are authors who are trying to. It's not that they're talking about individuals instead of talking about class. They're talking about individuals for the point of analyzing what exactly classes are, how classes work, uh, and um, and and in order precisely to sort of have a kind of sharpen the traditional Marxist analysis of class, right? So you mentioned just now class location and Chipper, and Oracle Wright's talking about contradictory class locations, the sense in which like some people are in positions where in one sense they have one class location, but in a different sense they have a different one, right? So an obvious example would be somebody who like has like if you're like if you're like a teacher but you're married to like a rich business owner, or like your parents are that or whatever, right? That'd be a case which like, okay, there's a certain sense in which your class location is the working class, but there's also a sense in which it's not, because that line you quoted earlier from Wright, what you have determines what you have to do in order to survive. You don't actually have to have that job, right? So that's like a small example of how that kind of analysis works. But I mean, like there is something. I mean, maybe just moving, starting to move just a little bit from the descriptive to the normative. I mean, like there is something both that's funny both about the, oh, you're talking about individuals, so this is like anti-Marxist liberalism sort of thing that you get from some people on the left, and then there's this equal and opposite thing that you get from some people who are self-conscious enemies of socialism, where they'll say like, oh, you're talking about collectives, and so you're not taking people seriously as individuals, and both of those sort of strike me as confused in about the same way, right? Because like
Yeah.
I always thought, yeah.
Oh yeah. So I didn't mean to. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that one of the I don't know, key insights of Marxism, or at least this rendering of Marxism, is that yes, in like individuals exist and are real and have their own particular interests, but they are constrained by social structures, and those social structures determine how interests can be shared and how interests can be opposed. Right? I mean, this is um, this is sort of one aspect of maybe of what Marx meant when he said individuals make history, but not just as they please. So you could have this totally atomized view of human beings and human agency that just says like we're all free, totally independent agents, and like we shouldn't look, we shouldn't like try to determine the look at the social determinants of behavior interests at all, which is like the sort of right wing libertarian position. And then there's this sort of muddle headed Hegelian or Hegelian interpretation of Marx that's like, oh, classes cannot be explained in terms of individuals or individual behavior at all. And that's I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, like when people say, actually, the guy I was debating in Texas, from the libertarian think tank. I think I actually did say at some point, and then I just never got a chance to go back to it, which is one of my few regrets about how the conversation went. Like something that was kind of along those lines, like treating people as collectives and not as individuals, whatever. It's like I never, like, just even at a really simple-minded level, I never understood what the difference is supposed to be between like a libertarian talking about like taxpayers as a category, being like, unjustly victimized, right?
Right.
And a socialist talking about workers. I mean, those are two like different analyses, but like but like they're not different in the sense that like one of them is about individuals or one of them is about categories. You're talking about, people, again, moving from the sort of descriptive question that we're talking about how you analyze how capitalism works to even the sort of normative questions about how to think about what's wrong with that, which is also something you spend a lot of time in the article about. Like, okay, there's nothing about saying that, the working class, right, the set of individuals who are in this particular class location, are by virtue of that, right? They have this kind of common complaint, and there's something that's like, and there's something that's wrong that's being done by having social institutions be this way to everybody in that category, and everybody in that category has a vested interest. To the extent that they do, it's complicated. That's what a lot of that right chipper kind of analysis is about, right? But has this vested interest in changing those institutions. I mean, there's nothing like, in the sense that, because like, look, I mean, in the sense that I can understand what somebody's talking about when they get upset about, like, oh, you should be talking about individuals. Like maybe if, like, just a philosophy nerd kind of example is like, maybe like utilitarianism or some forms of utilitarianism is like a view that actually doesn't treat people as individuals, because we're just sort of talking about like, we're just interested in like adding together all the units of happiness and subtracting units of suffering, and without like really being attentive to the fact that, people are suffering as individuals and, being wronged as individuals, whatever. And to the extent that I can kind of understand what somebody's getting upset about when they get upset about that, it's like, okay, but there's nothing about just doing class analysis or like having, or even saying there's something normatively objectionable about a certain set of class structures that takes us across that line, right? I mean, that isn't, sort of morally treating people as, individual human beings who matter individually.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's really well said. I mean, my best, it's hard to like work your way into the right wing mind space, but I mean, I think one thing that might be going on is like this idea that, well, capitalism, capitalist, the wage labor employment relationship, like that's all a matter of individuals making free choices. So to sort of treat this as a matter of, structural injustice or oppression is to not, respect individuals' free choices. And, that would also explain, maybe helps explain why they see a problem with, the taxpayers being victimized by the state versus, us saying that workers are exploited, dominated by capitalists. They, they're under the illusion that, the capitalist marketplace is this realm of freedom, whereas, it's only when the state steps in that you have something bad and objectionable. I guess that would, maybe that's my best.
No, I think that is definitely a thing that many of these guys think. Although, a point that I'd always push is that it's not like it's not like you can have capitalism without an enforcement mechanism, right? I mean, like
Right.
if you're saying like individual A owns, to put in Marx's term from Capital, individual A owns some money, and individual B only owns labor power. Like, well, a different way of saying that is that like the distribution of goods that the state is enforcing is one where
Yeah.
individual A
Right.
has that money and individual B doesn't, right? That's but yeah, I think that's and I think that's exactly right. That there is that people think, well, since these are meaningfully free transactions, if you're not treating it that way, you're not respecting people's free choices or whatever. But like, I guess I would say all the work is being done there by the first part of that sentence, right? Since these are meaningfully free transactions, right? Because of
Yeah.
course, like, yeah, a lot of the argument in Capital, for example, or a lot of or like one of the things that like G.A. Cohen argues, he has this classic paper, the structure of proletariat on freedom,
Yeah.
um, is well, but it's not, right. Like this is not actually meaningfully free because you have this you know massive power imbalance that leaves people who only own their labor power with very few realistic or at least acceptable choices other than making this arrangement.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think this is a good illustration of, I mean, just to move on to sort of the
Yeah.
next,
Yep.
I think, yeah, thing we wanted to talk about was like, this is a good illustration of why it's actually important to like do normative theory of the kind that people like Jerry Cohen were doing, right? Because like we want to be able to sort of explain in clear terms like what is wrong with the sort of right wing argument or right wing assumptions that says capitalism is fine. It's just a matter of adults, making free and informed consensual choices. I think that it's good that people are able to give arguments of the kind that you were just giving that explains what exactly is wrong with that, why actually by any sort of reasonable normative principles what's going on with workers under capitalism is not freedom. They're not making free and informed choices, and yeah, we should try to figure out something better.
Yeah, no, exactly. That you have yeah, I mean, like in that Cohen paper, structure proletariat of freedom, he has this like really nice point about how whenever we typically say that somebody is forced to do something, like what we typically mean, right, by saying that you weren't free not to do it, you were forced to do it, is like you didn't have any acceptable choices, right? If somebody puts a gun to your head
Mm-hmm.
and says fill up this sack, from the bank vault, um, it's not that literally the only thing you could do is fill it up, right?
Right.
Uh, you could just say a final prayer and say, nope, shoot me. You
Yeah.
could make a desperate attempt to wrestle the gun away. Like what we mean is you have no acceptable choices
Right. Right.
besides, you know, besides that one. So this takes us to another thing that I found really interesting about your article, which was the defense of John Rawls. So in the uh, so there are, like, I think a couple of different ways in which socialists or Marxists of some varieties, have a problem with Rawls. Uh, at the sort of most basic level, you kind of alluded to this earlier. There is like a strand of classical Marxism that says, um, let's just not bother,
Yeah.
with too much talk about morality or justice or whatever, and certainly let's not bother with it to the point of like sitting around theorizing about it. And like the only um, so it's like Cohen has this line. It's in his book. If you're an egalitarian, how come you're so rich? Which is my dumb joke about that book is always that I want to get to the point in life where that question is a good way to own me. But in that book, it's his Gifford lectures. There's a point where he's reminiscing about visiting communist Czechoslovakia, and his like uncle is a editor of a party journal there, and he's arguing with his uncle in Prague, and his uncle's like, "Why do you keep talking about all this morality stuff? That's just some like bourgeois nonsense. I don't know about that." He's like, "But uncle, whatever his name was, like you've dedicated your entire life to this movement. Surely that's like a moral commitment."
Right.
And he says, "No, I just, it's just that it's just that it's like in the interest of the working class to do this." And he's like, "But you're not part of the working class, right?"
Right, exactly.
What are you talking about? Like that can't be it, and so that's like one objection, that it's just like, well, let's like only talk about the descriptive issues, how capitalism works, how we think that's going to be overcome in the future, and let's not talk at all about the normative issues. Let's not talk about why it is that we find capitalism so objectionable. And then like maybe on a more interested level, there's some people object to what's sometimes called ideal theory, the idea that you should be in the business of like trying to figure out what would count as a society that's not objectionable at all, right, from the perspective of thinking about justice, and that's like utopian or unhelpful or artificial or something like that, and then like kind of on the last, like sort of moving to more and more concrete objections, like maybe the last one would be just something like a lot of even some socialists who are okay with both A and B, right? Both sort of moral theorizing and even doing it in that ideal theory way, just say, just think that like, they're sort of vaguely under the impression that Rawls is a liberal, and they want something that's like they want a theory that's like to the left of that, or maybe is like more demandingly egalitarian or something like that. So I know I just threw a lot at you, but any threads of that you wanted to pick up and run with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think maybe I'll leave the Cohen story as like a sufficient refutation of the first kind of line of thought. But yeah, in terms of objection to ideal theory, I'm convinced by the idea. I think maybe Tommy Shelby said this in an interview that we ran in Jacobin with him recently, that like any like critique of injustice, or sort of like critique of society as oppressive in some respect, like implies sort of a conception of like a non-oppressive or a just social set of social arrangements. So I think that if you think that we ought to be engaged in the project of social criticism at all, you have to allow ideal theory to some extent, to just thinking about like, well, what are non-oppressive or just social arrangements, at some level, what do those look like? So I don't think that's really a fair critique of Rawls.
If you're going to say, like, if you're going to be critical of you think there's something like unfair or bad or unjust about some set of social arrangements, it is kind of a legitimate question to say, like, okay, what would it take for
Right.
for you not to think that? Right, like what would it take for you to be satisfied? I mean, like I actually think on an intuitive level that's like a fairly obvious response, but okay, so this maybe brings us to the last one, which is the sort of impression that some people have, that's like, okay, but even if we're okay with doing ideal theory, maybe Rawls is doing like liberal ideal theory, whereas we want like better, more radical ideal theory.
Yeah, sorry, I lost you for a second.
Okay. Yeah, internet's all over the place tonight. So just more succinctly, maybe, right? So like the third objection, like that would just kind of leave us with the sort of third line of objection to Rawls, which is okay, even if we're okay with doing morality talk, even if we're okay with ideal theory, then then we you might still say, okay, but like Rawls sounds like he's doing some kind of like wishy-washy like lib ideal theory, right? I don't want liberal ideal
Right.
theory. I want like radical ideal theory.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like I think that there are actually like left critiques to be made of Rawls. I don't go with him all the way on everything, but yeah, I mean, I think that we should start by recognizing how sort of left or radical he actually is. I mean, what he's trying to do basically is say that, like, look, uh, we all live in a society. We have to figure out, like, what are the principles that we think should govern that society. What does a just society look like? And he's trying to figure out, this society should be justifiable to every person. He's taking for granted a certain kind of, like, you know post enlightenment liberal egalitarian viewpoint. And he's trying to say, well, what does that involve? Kind of giving equal respect, equal dignity to everyone. What would it mean to have a fair society? And that's why he comes up with this veil of ignorance idea, which is, okay, imagine you knew nothing about your location in a society that was going to come into being. You didn't know, your class. You didn't know what your talents were. You didn't know anything about your kind of idiosyncratic vision of the good. Obviously things like sex, gender, race, you don't know about. So, like, in figuring out the principles to govern society, given that you don't have any of that information about yourself, what would you choose? Assuming that you're, in this thought experiment, you're just looking out for yourself, maybe your family and your descendants, but you don't have any kind of like special concern for other people in society. And he thinks you're going to choose principles that basically provide everyone with equal basic political rights, in terms of free expression, right to vote, etc. And you're also going to want to, like, social and institutional arrangements benefit everybody, like, are to everybody's advantage, even the people who end up least privileged.
Mm-hmm.
So there are lots of critiques you can make about that argument. I think the veil of ignorance thought experiment is maybe just like not helpful for a lot of people. But the basic idea is society's basic institutions should be justifiable to everyone, regardless of accidents of birth. And, like, the implications of that he ends up drawing are actually pretty radical. I mean, he's clear that, like, welfare state capitalism is not good enough. I mean, this is why it's, like, crazy to me that, people like Sharinga say this thing, that he's some kind of apologist for American liberalism or, like, 20th century American capitalism. I mean, it's just like,
No,
I mean, he's pretty clear that that's not what he's.
Yeah, I mean, he explicitly says that not only is capitalism as it's instantiated in 20th century America not good enough, but that no possible form of capitalism would be, because even for exactly, at least one of the central reasons the socialists would say that that like the thing that he's identified about capitalism that makes it not good enough, even in its nicest, most welfare statey forms, is precisely that it's divided. That under capitalism, society is divided into this class of capitalists who own the means of production and a class of laborers who don't and have to go work for the first people. Right? I mean, that's his objection. And he says, okay, what would a society be that wouldn't be vulnerable to this objection? And he he's trying to be very careful about this. And he sort of says, because a very consistent methodological thing about Rawls is like, look, wherever there's a sort of empirical question about
Right.
what would, like, where, like, you're not, in order to come to a certain conclusion, you wouldn't just need the value premise. You wouldn't just need the premise about justice. You'd also need some sort of question about what the empirical facts are like in practice. Then, he sort of always takes a pass on that and says, look, I'm just trying to figure out the premise about justice.
Right.
You guys figure it out and ask the sociologists and economists and everybody about the other premise. So because he's doing that here, he says, well, you could either, here are kinds of societies that, unlike even the most advanced social democratic kind of capitalism, would fulfill the requirements of justice. One would be some sort of liberal socialism. He doesn't go into any great detail, but he sort of says, collective ownership of the means of production, basically, but also you're respecting everybody's democratic rights. It's not like Stalinism. And then the other is, it says property owning democracy, which is super duper vague about what that means. But but it seems to be something like if you have somehow or another ownership relations are dispersed enough that there isn't like a sort of meaningful separation between here's like a class of workers, the class of capitalists. Everybody just kind of owns stuff. And, it seems to me that whatever you think about that, like, I actually think that that's, like there's something about that way of setting things up that's actually totally consistent with the sort of Marxist view, which is you could say, look, that quote from the 18th premier of Louis Bonaparte that you mentioned earlier, right? They make their own history, but not under circumstances of their own choosing. That like it's like, yeah, we don't. I mean, look, in principle, if we could just have a society of smallholders where everybody,
Right.
like nobody had to go to work for anybody else, or at least not for very long, because everybody just owns their own little thing, whatever. It's like, yeah, I guess I mean, at least as far as the sort of like, it's bad to have a society that's divided into a ruling class, labor class objection. I guess that would solve it, but like historically, that's just not on the table at this point in the development of like a complex modern economy.
Right. Yeah. I mean that bit is a little puzzling to me. Why he didn't
Yeah,
sort of grapple with that idea more. But yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of people. I feel like one of the other sort of dominant trends in moral philosophy now that a lot of people who are socialists or sympathetic to socialism are advancing now is this kind of like republicanism or neo-republicanism, basically trying to come up with a theory of justice that's based around the idea of non-domination. And I think you see a similar dynamic there where basically like people are drawing on this tradition that uh, I think a lot of Republican philosophers now and historically have been advocates of like a society of smallholders, like a
right.
sort of smallholder property owning society. But yeah, I think the argument is the same there that, you know, given historical development, that is no longer a possibility. And so pushes towards us thinking, it basically thinking in terms of what a socialist society without domination should look like. But yeah, I basically think Rawls gets you to a very similar place, and yeah, he makes good moral arguments that I think people should grapple with seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I also, uh, I mean, look, I think, you know, I mean, I agree with you what you said earlier that there are legitimate, left critiques of Rawls, although honestly, some of the ones that are the most popular, I don't know that I would include in that category, right? There's so like a lot of people sort of do this like thing that's like, oh well, he's assuming this sort of universal subject, or you wouldn't,
Yeah.
you don't know what it's like to you can't know that you would endorse something if you didn't know whether you were, because like our subjectivity is too thoroughly bound up with these facts about ourselves or whatever. And I actually don't really buy any of that. I think those are like pretty bad objections. I think like even to the extent that you grant that it's psychologically impossible to like remove yourself from these facts about your identity or whatever, it's like, okay, one, you clearly can at least a little bit, right?
Right.
Like, and two, to the extent that you can, it's like that might be an epistemic barrier to your figuring out what would count, what would be a just society. But it's not clear to me that that's a great objection to say that that's what a just society is. Like I think a sort of better, objection is is maybe a version of like the Jacobin one about how there's a that's like all else being equal, less inequality is always better, and that or less inequality of a certain kind, is always better. And granted, it's not always equal, because sometimes you have these trade-offs where you might need a little bit of inequality for the sake of incentives or whatever, but you should sort of keep your eye on the idea that, that ultimately it's progress to the extent that we don't need to do that, anymore, or we need to do that less or something like that. Those sorts of criticisms I can buy into a lot more, but also I don't know. I think the basic Rawlsian framework, I do think, even if you think it's not the whole story, I do think that it seems pretty compelling to me as a way of capturing at least one really important part of what we care about when we're thinking about justice.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm on the same page. I mean, yeah, I don't want to get into the Cohen Rawls debate, but
fair enough. Yes.
I'm on the same page. I think the central idea of Rawls again is just everyone counts equally, but also we're all individuals. We want to avoid this sort of utilitarian sacrificing some for the benefit of others that you mentioned before. But all individuals ought to be treated equally and have equal chances, and society should be structured in a way that ensures that. I think that's a great sort of normative starting point for thinking about what a socialist society would look like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. So yeah, I really enjoyed the article. This is something, I'm always really happy to see stuff like this in Jacobin. So once again, this we've got a link to it, I believe, in the description. But it's called "How Analytic Philosophers Have Made Sense of Capitalism." Everybody should check it out. Thank you again, Nick. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.